I don't know about you, but for me, I've always been interested and confounded at the same time about right-wing posts on social media, podcasts, messaging, websites, pamphlets, etc. And they tend to talk about things like the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, Federal Reserve, George Soros, New World Order, WEF, and they're littered with concepts such as patriotism, the Constitution, Christianity, and sometimes Christian nationalism. This video will discuss some of the core conspiracies and ideologies that have driven right-wing extremism for decades in the United States. The purpose is to describe how modern-day right-wing politics maintains strong and at times direct connection to them. The result of these conspiracies that might have started in fringe churches or in reaction to the civil rights movement or from within the militia movement is ultimately the mainstreaming of far-right reactionary politics within the Republican Party. This extremism has been adopted by the GOP, resulting in success of the MAGA movement, rejection of democracy, and ultimately insurrection on January 6th. It is important for us to understand the nature of conspiracies in right-wing political thought because it informs us on the fundamental beliefs behind the outrageous tweets, doomed policy, and what otherwise might be seen as performative political theater. Indictments of sedition for Oath Keepers and the accompanying communications amongst the group proves that this is not just performative shock value. The success of Trump, the first post-truth president, who entered a political scene as a clownish conspiracist hawking birtherism conspiracies rooted in racism, nativism, and anti-communism, as we will see, proves the political legitimacy of right-wing extremism built upon conspiracy. And it's not as if the global right or domestic right in the United States is unaware of these connections. They know very well what they're doing and why they're doing it. And as a matter of fact, instead of actually addressing some of this racism, anti-Semitism based in conspiracism, instead they just flip it into a new conspiracy, talking about things like big tech and censorship. But of course, we know that there is substance to these accusations about racism and anti-Semitism. And while this video is going to break it down for you piece by piece, I think that we can just blow those out of the water right away. Here's a PDF that I got from a white nationalist called The Red Pill. Now, I'll do a separate video on this because it's worthwhile, but there is a section here called Unmasking the Serpent that essentially is a rebuttal to that Breitbart article. And this starts out pretty much how we would expect. It's saying how isms like racism and sexism are replacing Christianity and religion, and that's a problem. It's relying on a former KBG agent to discuss this because it's a global conspiracy, of course. Black Lives Matter is brought up, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, etc. It goes on to talk about how Joseph McCarthy was actually correct and how he's demonized. But down here is where we get to the root of it. People like the Rothschilds, the Epsteins of the world, Weinstein, George Soros, people who are sponsoring groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa and are setting up blackmail rings in the media and politics. Well, of course, these people are the globalists, the bankers, people gaming the stock market, the elites, the investment bankers, etc. Well, these people are part of a communist plot. Communism is mixed with Satanism. We see that very often. A global communist conspiracy. And here we are. It is time to put the puzzle pieces into place if you have not done so already. The Rothschilds are Jewish. Soros is Jewish, Epstein is Jewish, Weinstein is Jewish, Maxwell is Jewish, and the father had tons of Mossad ties. Read through how shady he is and remember Wikipedia, etc., etc. And then it enters into communism. But here you go. This is the behind the scenes rebuttal, essentially, to that Breitbart article. And so this is the message behind the words, and it's especially troubling when it's coming from the current Speaker of the House talking about 3 Jewish men buying elections. or a representative talking about vengeance from the Lord and the uniparty globalist agenda. Starting points are a bit subjective and defined not by a historical timeline of thought, but really in terms of scope. There are simply too many conspiracies and conspiracy adjacent topics to cover in a single video. That being said, I have outlined what I consider to be the most important concepts, people, and movements for discussion regarding the right in the modern era. Much of right-wing conspiracy and general populist conspiracy is based in Christianity, whether directly or indirectly, whether the person spouting it realizes it or not. And in one way, one could describe the notion of a good God and sneaky devil seeking to lead individuals astray to capture their souls, somewhat of a conspiracy in and of itself. One can't help but see the parallels to later phenomena like McCarthyism. Staying within the realm of Christianity, because ultimately that's where much of this content originates from. There are many other analogies one could make, such as maybe defying the central government of Rome. But if we're speaking honestly here, it really comes down to the crucifixion of Christ. And not just the crucifixion of Christ, but who did the crucifixion of Christ, or who was blamed for the crucifixion of Christ: the Pharisees, aka Jewish people. Many right-wing conspiracies, again, directly or indirectly, can be traced back to anti-Semitic tropes. Whether the particular iteration has replaced the word Jew with banker to make it more socially acceptable, or perhaps the concept or story has been so abstracted from the original that it's actually what the person is saying it understands it to mean, words like globalist or elite, etc. But regardless of what the person or messenger understands the message to be, this is ultimately where those messages come from: anti-Semitism. And one of those anti-Semitic tropes is blood libel. We're going to look at that. The blood libel conspiracy states that Jewish people kill Christians, especially Christian children, for ritual purposes in making Passover matzah or to mock the passion of the Christ. And this dates back to the 12th century. Don't worry, we'll get closer to modern times soon, but this is important foundational information to understand. A monk named Thomas of Monmouth was instrumental in spreading the conspiracy based upon unsubstantiated claims regarding the death of a young boy. He broadened the conspiracy to include a secret cabal of rabbis who met yearly to choose a Christian child to be sacrificed. So here we have the outlining of a global cabal meeting in secret to kill children. The members of the cabal are outside or others, social others, attacking the pure Christian children. This conspiracy took off from there, with numerous books written on Jewish people, conflating them with the devil and other conspiracies that we will soon get to. Already, I'm sure that you see the parallels, and this, of course, informs a QAnon conspiracy in which a secret cabal of pedophiles seeks to capture children for adrenochrome harvesting. This adrenochrome is taken from, you guessed it, the blood of children. This conspiracy has broadened out to seemingly benign iterations, such as concerned parent groups and internet groups based around child trafficking. And these things aren't inherently bad until you understand the motivation and origin for participating. Getting back to the secret cabal that Thomas of Monmouth talked about, this leads us to the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was first published in Russia in 1903 as a hoax, but came from earlier iterations, and it can actually be traced back quite a while. One of the historical places that this can be traced back to was Napoleon, in a meeting that he had with Jewish leaders of conquered territories of Europe called the Great Sanhedrin. This was condemned by the Russian Orthodox Church, who called Napoleon the Antichrist for reuniting the Jews whom God's wrath had scattered over the face of the earth. It was around this time that a fake letter was published. It was supposedly written by an army officer named J.B. Simonini, and made some of the first connections between Masonic and Jewish conspiracy, which acted as a precursor to the protocols of learned elders of Zion. The myth says that there is a secret global cabal that operates in the shadows, which controls political parties, governments, media, banks, and economics. The secret government is run by Jewish people with the goal of achieving one world government to dominate all non-Jewish people. Again, we clearly see the template used by contemporary right-wing conspiracists. Sometimes the word Jewish is simply removed. Unfortunately, we see this cross-pollinate into other areas as well, such as alt-imperialist and the dirtbag left. But there is a clear distinction here, and I want to get that out in the front. One can clearly critique something such as global capitalism and do so from a material standpoint and point of view. To do so, one does not require such populist conspiracies. If one chooses to implement these types of conspiracies, then that's where the skepticism should come in, because we see the origins of them and where they come from. They're not needed for a critique, therefore they're used with purpose. And so this has been the introduction portion. Now we have a foundation and a basic understanding of where some of these core conspiracies are coming from, and it's going to be very significant as we move forward into Christian identity, segregation, racism, anti-communism, etc., because the leaders and the people who merge these different concepts, tax protests, for instance, are going to come from a place of anti-Semitism. The stories and narratives that they present are going to be rehashed tales of what we've already spoken about, etc. So this is a good foundation. Next, we're going to move into a concept, something called the serpent seed theory. Serpent seed doctrine is yet another crucial conspiracy to grasp. The doctrine is foundational to Christian identity churches in the US that had far-reaching influence on the modern right. The idea is that Eve in the Garden of Eden mated with the serpent, which created a different race of people from those descended from Adam. Cain was the offspring from Eve's union with the serpent or the devil, and conflict between the races that descended from Cain and Adam have been the driver of human history and human conflict. This story did exist in early Gnostic writing, but was rejected as hearsay. Now, you might have seen on that previous slide something about the descendants having moved from the Middle East into Europe, and how that would make white Europeans the actual descendants of Jewish people, right? Or, well, it gets complicated. So we'll start here with British Israelism, because this is going to elaborate on what's just fundamentally a very confusing and contradictory idea, but again, one that's foundational and is going to be foundational and actually woven into some of the very fabric of ideas about what the United States comes to be. So here we have British Israelism as a collection of thinkers and Bible students since the 16th century who have held that England, Great Britain, is genetically, racially, and linguistically the descendant of ancient Israelites. So British Israelism, this spans back again to 1600s, 1500s possibly, that Puritans wrote about an imminent millennium and the central role that Britain would play in it. This belief continued to exist when pilgrims emigrated to North America. This is one part of this. Another part of this is John Wilson, who popularized the idea that the lost tribes of Israel had migrated to northwestern Europe. Following this logic of British Israelism, Israel was broken into geographic locations. The northern kingdom of Israel is where Europeans supposedly originated from, while modern-day Jewish people were from the southern kingdom of Judah. The bulk of biblical prophecies were linked to tribes of Israel, and specifically the tribe of Ephraim, which was, again, supposedly populated on the British Isles. But long story short, what British Israelism and really John Wilson began to do was divide up the territory that constituted Israel find the geographic areas where the bulk of these prophecies were happening and claim that those descendants of those people are actually Europeans, specifically British people in this example, and that the remaining people in the other geographic location that did not have as many prophecies based around them in the Bible are today modern Jewish people. So following this logic, and I know it's not logic, but following this narrative regardless, this meant that Britain held a special place of religious preeminence, since it could now be traced back to Ephraim, the son of Joseph. Edward Hines, much later, we're talking the late 1800s, later added to Wilson's work by reimagining Ephraim as all of Israel, but for the 13th tribe to be Manasseh, and this became associated with the United States. So the United States was essentially the 13th tribe. The House of Judah comprised contemporary Jewish people who were never lost, but who denied the Messiah status of Christ. The Jews are of Israel, but Israel is not of Judea or Judah. Results, well, this means that white Europeans and Americans became the biblical descendants of Israel, while contemporary Jewish people held no claims to biblical prophecy. Again, the Jews are of Israel, but Israel is not of Judah. And you might be saying at this point, why are we talking about this crazy stuff that has nothing to do with Donald Trump, January 6th, things that are happening today on Twitter? Well, because again, we're working our way up to it. And if we're thinking about a worldview, this is how it's being formed. And a great example of this in action could be former President Ronald Reagan's speech about the city upon a hill and the notion of American exceptionalism. And this is tied to many things, whether it's imperialism or manifest destiny. But in our specific conversation, this is tied to the idea that there is something unique and special about the United States. And the concept of this shining city on a hill dates back to the time of the Pilgrims, as mentioned earlier with British Israelism and their concept of the significance of Britain and their origins in world concepts and world happenings. So the Pilgrim Fathers were a band of Puritans who founded the colony of Plymouth, Massachusetts. If you're not up on your early U.S. history, I'm from the region, so this is beaten into my brain. Their leader, John Winthrop, made a historic speech referring to them all as being a city on a hill. And there's one key piece to this that I think we need to talk about, and it's that if the Puritans failed to uphold their covenant with God, then their sins and errors would be exposed for the world to see. So there's two things here. One, that if their settlements or future progress, I guess you could say eventually the United States, errs in its way, that this is going to be exposed. And so that there are going to be signs that we're not following the path of God. And then the second part of this is going to be the idea that Puritans had a covenant with God. And this is extremely significant if we're talking about serpent seed theory or doctrine, as well as British Israelism, because inherent in both ideas, and British Israelism could be its own video, there's a lot to that, but inherent in these ideas, generally speaking, is the idea that people who call themselves Jewish today are not actually Jews in the sense of the Bible, and that white Europeans, who in this case came to the United States and then eventually the United States, were the actual people who had the covenant with God. It means that Jewish people are faking who they are or lying about who they are. And it also brings up this idea, and in the Old Testament, of course, God has a special covenant with the Jewish people, the chosen people, that the Puritans now have that covenant. And therefore, Israel, Jewish people cannot. Now, I'm skipping ahead quite a bit. We'll see this slide again in the future, but there are many versions and iterations of this idea, whether it be serpent seed of two different races, whether we look at British Israelism and how the geographic location could be structured and broken up in such a way as to divide peoples into one having a covenant with God and one not so much. There's another one called the Kahzar hypothesis, in which modern day Jewish people aren't actually ethnically Jewish, but instead migrated from Eastern Europe or maybe like Turkish peoples. I'm bringing this up because it just so happened that a book talking about that conspiracy was suggested to be bought with the book The Iron Curtain Over America, which we're going to talk about later, but that ties anti-Semitism with anti-communism. And so, not to confuse the listener into thinking this is all about anti-Semitism, it's not. It's just that it's a core piece to the broader story. And going back to serpent seed doctrine and transitioning into Christian identity, which is really where we begin to pick up. This was revived in the late 19th century by authors such as Charles Totten and Daniel Parker. Parker was an early influence on American Christian identity movement adherence, and that's very important. That's the tie. That's what brings us into the United States. We could say the 1800s, but we're going to focus on the 19th or 20th century, excuse me, and these people coming up specifically. American leaders within this movement of note include Wesley Swift and Bill Gale. And these two people, especially Bill Gale, are going to be integral to the formation in the 1950s of what we see in the GOP today. Swift and Gale will go on to tie these ideas to anti-communism and tax protest, along with racial grievances of the civil rights movement and desegregation. It is from that era and content that much modern right-wing conspiracy and even broader populist conspiracy springs from. These figures also participated in proto-militias long before the militia movement surged in the 1990s, and then the revival during the Tea Party era, giving us the Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and kind of ultimately January 6th, I suppose. Organizations like the California Rangers were a template for these later militia movement, such as the Montana Freemen, for instance. Going back to serpent seed doctrine and Christian identity to kind of pull this all together before we move on to a different topic. Serpent seed doctrine was revived in the late 19th century by authors such as Charles Totten and Daniel Parker. Parker was an early influence on the American Christian identity movement. American leaders within this movement of note include Wesley Swift and Bill Gale. Swift and Gale will go on to tie these ideas to anti-communism and tax protest, along with racial grievances of the civil rights movement and desegregation. And it's from that era and content that much modern right-wing conspiracy and general populist conspiracy spring from. These figures also participate in proto-militias long before the militia movement surged in the 1990s, and then again under the Obama administration, which is what gave us the Three Percenters, but also Oath Keepers, and perhaps ultimately January 6th. Organizations like the California Rangers were an early template for these later groups. This is from Religion and the Racist Right, the Origins of the Christian Identity Movement. In one sense, Christian identity is barely half a century old. It's a doctrinal basis was established after World War II by a network of independent preachers that we just talked about, Bill Gale, Wesley Swift. But it passed rapidly from their hands into a variety of extreme right-wing political movements preoccupied with fears of racial mixing, Jewish conspiracy, and through these organizations as the Aryan Nation, Ku Klux Klan, Christian identity had by the 1970s become, if not white supremacist orthodoxy, at least its most important religious tendency. And while that is true, I also argue that it goes far beyond the Aryan Nation and KKK into mainstream white suburban America. We're going to switch gears a little bit now, because to fully understand the conspiracies and political ideas of the modern, well, moderate right, I suppose, which is actually an extreme right, we need to understand and step back a little bit into American history. The American colonies and the eventual United States was largely founded on chattel slave plantation. John C. Calhoun was a defender of slavery, and it's no coincidence that he was also a defender of states' rights, as these go hand in hand in early America. His nullification doctrine claimed that states had a right to ignore federal policy they deemed unconstitutional. Other states would need a constitutional amendment to prevent that state from doing so, and that state could then secede if it chose to. Calhoun considered any restriction on slavery an unconstitutional violation of the rights of slaveholding states as equal members of the federal compact in the United States. This white supremacist ideology, tied to views of federalism in the Constitution, was later used to justify Southern secession and ultimately the Civil War. While this failed and was dealt a death blow by not only Supreme Court findings, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, it would later be used by segregationists and racists who would justify defying civil rights legislation and court decisions based upon states' rights, which were rooted in white supremacy. This is not so much a conspiracy as a racist interpretation that's used to dog whistle or obscure openly racist beliefs. It will later be combined in the cocktail of Christianity, anti-communism, and conspiracy to forge the current political realities of the GOP. One more piece of American legislation also needs to be addressed. I'm not going to speak to that yet, though. There's more to John C. Calhoun than nullification doctrine, and we're going to get to that later. But just as a preview, we're going to be discussing everything from the militia movement to sovereign citizens. There's one more piece of American history legislation that we need to talk about before we jump forward a little bit into some foundations of the modern GOP. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which removed the military from regular civil law enforcement, was hugely influential and led to the Posse Comitatus organization, which was a precursor to the modern right-wing extremist organizations we know about today. The act was meant to prevent federal marshals in the South during Reconstruction from using army troops to enact federal law and protect the Black community. This was a victory for Southern white supremacists who fought against all progress made for African Americans. It coincided with the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and represented a return to home rule and introduction of Jim Crow, Black codes, and unfettered racial violence against African American people in the South. This act will be used later to argue against federal enforcement of school desegregation with troops. States' rights became cover for bigotry and resistance to the civil rights movements. Another way to think about it is that white supremacists again faced loss of institutional power, as it had briefly during Reconstruction of the South after the Civil War, and took up resistance to the civil rights movement, 1950s and 60s, as a second lost cause. Perhaps most notable, this was a point of focus for Bill Gale, the Christian identity preacher that we discussed earlier and founder of racist proto-militia movements. So now we have a mixture of anti-Semitic global conspiracies that are blaming Jewish people in a variety of ways for ills of white Europeans and their descendants in the United States. And we also have a history in the United States of chattel slavery and plantation economy. And we have a ideology that justifies that from a constitutional lens in John C. Calhoun and Nullification, and we'll add to that later, there's a lot more to it, as well as the idea of the Posse Comitatus Act, which again is going to be expanded upon, stating that federal troops cannot be used to enforce federal law in the South during Reconstruction. And essentially, handed over home rule to racist Southerners, and we enter into the era of black codes and Jim Crow. So the rise of right-wing radio is extremely important because Wesley Smith and Bill Gale initially got their word out by using this medium, as well as making tapes and maybe some records and newsletters. But the radio was very significant for them. So Wesley Swift and Bill Gale are two foundational folks in this movement. Identity preachers could be heard in churches and the airwaves leading up to the pivotal 1950s era. I say it's pivotal. That's my opinion, and we'll talk about why. Father Charles Coughlin is somewhat of a precursor, and I think a bridge between talking about the late 1800s to the 1950s. So Charles Coughlin lays the groundwork for radio priests by using the platform to denounce FDR as a communist and expose Hollywood celebrities or elites as Jewish financiers. A 1938 volume of his publication, Social Justice, includes excerpts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And perhaps a different topic for a different video, but to make a point, there is a direct line, a direct lineage between the things that Father Coughlin and then later Bill Gale and Wesley Swift, the things that they talked about, the way that they framed the world, the manner in which they spoke, their dialogue, and etc. There's a direct line from that to the modern phenomena of right-wing talk radio, maybe like Michael Savage and Rush Limbaugh, but especially with the advent of Fox News, people like Bill O'Reilly, and then later Tucker Carlson. This is especially significant because today, with the use of populism, trying to mix left-wing and right-wing ideas and justify someone like a Jimmy Dore, for instance, going on Tucker Carlson, this is the root of that critique, in that there's a lineage going back to the era of when this all began, the radio firebrands. And well, we're going to see, especially with Bill Gale, that the identity movement relied on it heavily initially for organizing and what became of that organizing. Let's get into it. Wesley Swift. Wesley Swift was a mentor to Bill Gale. Ideas or influence from John Wilson's 19th century theory of British Israelism. He assisted in the revival of the KKK in the 1940s. Swift believed and promoted the idea of a militarized end-of-the-world apocalypse, which would culminate in a war between the races. This is essentially the narrative for the Turner Diaries that were published much later, which directly influenced the actions of Timothy McVeigh. So if you want a direct line. Swift was the leader of the California Rangers. I have conflicting information of whether it's him or Bill Gale, but also a significant part of the Christian Defense League, or proto-militias, essentially. This document is from Mystical Antisemitism and the Christian Identity Movement, a narrative criticism of Dan Gaiman's The Two Seeds of Genesis. But what I'm interested in here is some documentation about the California Rangers and Swift. Swift's ascendancy as the country's leading identity preacher happened during the turmoil associated with the civil rights movement. As his name spread among factions of the militant far right, the government investigated his activities, and in 1965, the Attorney General of California released a report on paramilitary activities. The report branded Swift as a prolific organizer who was instrumental in launching an assortment of far-right groups, including the Anglo-Saxon Congregation of Los Angeles, the California League Against Communism, the Christian Defense League, and the California Rangers. It is significant to note that the report identified the latter group, the Rangers, as a paramilitary organization for white supremacists. While Swift is significant and someone who should have time spent on, I think it's really Bill Gale that is going to be the center of this discussion moving forward. And I put his date of death, 1988, here, just so we can see how long or the time in which his lifespan occurred and how recent in relative terms he was to what we see in the 1990s, at least, with the militia movement, which kind of fed into the Tea Party, and we'll get to that. But 1988 is when he died. He followed Wesley Swift's Christian identity, ideas, and doctrines. He participated in politics, organizations, and paramilitary creation. He was a central figure in the merging of Christian identity from a fringe religious belief to an influence on topics ranging from anti-communism to taxes and desegregation. And that is why he is so vitally important. He was a key figure in the Christian Patriot movements in the 1980s, and he died in prison for tax evasion. And so I kind of want to pause here because Bill Gale, I can't underestimate how significant he is to the story and to the understanding of what's going on today with the Republican Party. And I think oftentimes things that I've seen don't necessarily portray him in that manner. Yes, he was a Christian identity preacher. Yes, he engaged in paramilitary activities. He also came up with the idea of Posse Comitatus, which we're going to talk about too. However, all of that is important and has influences on more fringe groups like the Aryan nations, et cetera. But to me, the most important thing is this merging with anti-communism and taxes, because that's what legitimizes and that's what makes these templates and concepts socially acceptable. This is what moves things into the mainstream for middle class America, especially during the 1950s and desegregation. Wesley Swift's library is available online. I don't suggest you go and visit it, but I just grabbed some screenshots of things so that you could get an idea of what's on there. And the cross and the flag, for instance, this was like a radio show that was done that proliferated these Christian identity ideas, which are inherently anti-Semitic, kind of based in British Israelism, going back to serpent seed doctrine even. Taking that and the segregationalist arguments, kind of framed from within a legalistic constitutional argument against things like desegregation, for instance, right? And all the inherent racism involved with that. And combine that with tax protest and anti-communism and things that more mainstream folks could get behind. Also here, though, there's some other things I want to touch on. We have an obituary for Swift in which he's called a great patriot. This is also the time when the term patriot begins being used to describe extremists. And of course, we know that today the term patriot has completely been, appropriated by the far right, and even ideas of Christian nationalism and patriotism too. But it's important to know that it's from within this dynamic of anti-Semitic Christian identity, as well as Posse Comitatus and some of these proto-paramilitary organizations, that the term patriot begins being used to describe members and people of like minds. But there's more modern things on here too. So people are still posting, although it's a little bit dated. In the lower right, we have obviously a white supremacist show that's continuing. There was a lot to do with immigration, especially going to the Nordic countries, Sweden. This was a big thing a few years ago now, but there was a lot coming out from the alt-right and from other right-wing sources during this time about how immigrants were coming and they were ruining Sweden, and that there are these mass rapes and a lot of just kind of racism, but described from within the lens of immigration, which is something that the modern Republican Party does as well. I did find one about Confederates for Donald Trump, warning about ethnic cleansing that's going to happen, the New World Order. Things like that should sound familiar because we just talked about where they come from. They come from things like the Elders of Zion. They come from Christian identity, British Israelism, and those anti-Semitic conspiracies that existed, blood libel, the protocols prior to that, dating back to the crucifixion of Christ, really. So now let's get this into the 1950s, because this, for me, is a thesis. Everything has been backstory, context, getting to, I think, the era in which we begin to see direct connections to the modern Republican Party. In order to explain Swift and especially Gale's significance, we need to understand the cultural and political backdrop of the era in connection with the history we've spoken of to this point. Two major events, the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, provided an opportunity for those who might have previously been fringe to attract a much broader audience. All of a sudden, states' rights, which might previously have been associated with Southern grievances over race, applied to suburban white Protestant families regarding school desegregation after Brown v. Board of Education or busing and associated issues with taxes. The nefarious global cabal previously identified as being Jewish became communist via Jewish Bolshevism and in conspiracies within that. Tax protesters were no longer hillbillies, but middle-class adults who saw their money going to programs and more specifically the people, more specifically still Black people, which they disagreed with. All of a sudden, the narratives of the Southern lost cause and Christian identity applied to a much broader swath of the population in terms of anti-communism, states' rights, tax protests, and an overbearing federal government. All of this, of course, steeped in racist US history and anti-Semitic Christian tropes. The 1950s and 1960s were the decades which combined the conspiratorial elements discussed to this point with actual political movements and organizations. While the House Committee on Un-American Activities had existed for many years in differing forms, before Joseph McCarthy, it was Joseph McCarthy that made it infamous. McCarthy was, of course, initially described as an American patriot fighting global Bolshevist communism. This isn't simply correlation either. McCarthy had to withdraw items from the congressional record that were written by an associate named Upton Close. This only occurred after David Rabinowitz, co-chair of the Federated Jewish Charities in Wisconsin, sent a letter of protest to Joseph McCarthy. In response, McCarthy wrote a letter to Upton Close stating that, now, we saw Joseph McCarthy mentioned in the Red Pill, that PDF provided by a white nationalist, but the House Committee on Un-American Activities had, of course, existed prior to McCarthy. However, we know it was really McCarthy that made the institution infamous. And McCarthy was, of course, initially described as an American patriot. However, that description can get into finer details. An American patriot fighting global Bolshevist communism, for instance. And, this isn't just correlation either. McCarthy had to withdraw items from the congressional record that were written by Upton Close. This was only after David Rabinowitz, who was co-chair of the Federated Jewish Charities in Wisconsin, sent a letter of protest to Joseph McCarthy. And what did McCarthy write to Upton Close in response? He wrote this: "You can be certain that you or any other radio commentator who takes part in the anti-communist fight will also be smeared from heck to breakfast." Joseph McCarthy writing to the anti-Semite Upton Close. This document is entitled Anti-Semitism in the United States in 1949. It was digitized by the Anti-Defamation League, January 2009. This report discusses Upton Close, and here talks about his activities in Los Angeles. He was a columnist and commentator who was openly anti-Semitic during 1947. Early in that year, Close discontinued his national network broadcast. He was once a highly paid lecturer. He became a person non grata on an increasing number of Americans because of his anti-Semitic activities. By the end of the year, his appearances on lecture platforms were comparatively few in the number and trifling in importance. His syndicated column was dropped by some newspapers. This was before Joseph McCarthy was actually using him as a source, as a research go-to during his time investigating communists in the United States. Close also wrote many pamphlets and distributed them. One of Close's pamphlets, the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and its use in the World Communist Offensive was one of the pamphlets that stands out in history and has been cited by the ADL. It was distributed in the thousands by professional anti-Semites throughout the country. It was a repetition of the well-worn anti-Semitic canards, which seek to identify Judaism with communism, conveyed a false notion that the great majority of Jews are communists, and spread the lie that Jews participated prominently in the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1951, Army Colonel John O. Beaty published The Iron Curtain Over America, and well, you can buy it on Amazon if you want to. The book links anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracies to global communism, and even prompted the ADL to write yet another letter in 1955 to General Stratemeyer, who was Lieutenant General in senior command of the U.S. Air Force. This letter can be found online, and it describes to the general how the book is anti-Semitic and the issue with tying Judaism and Jewish people to communism in this time, the height of the Cold War, McCarthyism, how that leverages existing prior conspiracies and anti-Semitic tropes against Jewish people, but also, given those specific current events, how it endangers Jewish people. So we discussed the Kahzar theory, which is somewhat of the main thrust behind this book, but what makes this book significant is that Beaty said these Judaized Khazars were an indigestible mass of Bolsheviks in the political body. So this is tying all the things that we talked about before, the global conspiracy, the secret cabals, the elders of Zion, all those things that used to just be about anti-Semitism and Judaism. Now it's combining that with communism, and that's very important because many of the conspiracies that exist today, maybe in broader populist terms, originate from this era. And this is how you can tell somebody, look, you're saying an anti-Semitic canard, and they maybe honestly don't even realize that they are, and argue, no, I'm not. The WEF or the New World Order or the global elites, the globalists, etc., don't have to be Jewish. Well, this is when all that started coming together. The book also defended Nazi Germany and posited that World War II was a diabolical plot put in motion by Khazars in the Democratic Party with the goal of killing as many Aryans as possible. And so, this book was being given to soldiers to read. The ADL had to write a letter to one of the top commanders, Stratemeyer, to tell him, stop suggesting people read this book, right? But it also begins to combine these conspiracies and these ideas of communism and these international conspiracies based in anti-Semitism with the Democratic Party. We're going to pivot a little bit here, but it's just important to understand these conspiracies rooted in mythology such as blood libel and the proto-cause, elders of Zion and serpent seed doctrine are now mashed into what could be called Jewish Bolshevism and repackaged as anti-communism at the height of McCarthyism. And this is the era in which Tea Party, MAGA, Populist right, this is where they began to get their mythos. This is where they get their lore from. Is this time specifically, not this time frame on a timeline, but the ideas from this time, whether it be looking back in the past in U.S. history, or whether it be ideas that were somewhat invented in this time, at least within the United States. One of the political organizations that sprung from this era was the Christian Nationalist Party, or Constitution Party. Founded in 1952, it was a political wing of the Christian Nationalist Crusade, founded by Gerald L.K. Smith. It had a publication entitled The International Jew. Its purpose was to oppose communism, one world government, desegregation, and immigration. It placed General MacArthur on his ticket in abstention, and this is an interesting topic, maybe a side quest for this video. But a significant part of that story is one that MacArthur wanted to continue the Korean War. He wanted to be the aggressor and continue to fight communism, potentially even with nuclear weapons, but also that MacArthur never denounced this. Whereas other people on Republican tickets, tried to distance themselves from groups like this at the time. Bill Gale returns, and this is why Bill Gale, again, is going to be important. He's going to be the through line to much of the narrative from here on out. Bill Gale, the Christian identity preacher, was chairman and ran for governor on the California ticket for the Christian Nationalist Party. This is also the same era in which the Christian Defense League is started. And again, with the California Rangers, the paramilitary organization, and Christian Defense League, there's some conflicting things I found between Wesley Swift and Bill Gale involving them. But what I found for this was Bill Gale went on to found the Christian Defense League with a Klansman. The activist organization merged politics and religion. The paramilitary arm was the California Rangers, as mentioned before, and it was an early expression of Christian nationalism and militia movements. And so this is vital because now we have a political party, albeit a small one, but a political party with Christian nationalists. We have a activist organization with the Christian Defense League, and we also have a paramilitary wing with California Rangers and we'll see later Posse Comitatus how that blows up. But you have to remember the people who are creating these are Christian identity preachers. So they come from the legacy of British Israelism and the elders and blood libel and all the anti-Semitic tropes up to this point. What they're doing now is embracing essentially the anti-communist rhetoric, as well as the combination or conflation of Jewish people with Bolshevism, right? So everything that they said before just about Jewish people is now juxtaposed onto communism because communism is Bolshevism, right? So now we have this interesting phenomenon occurring, which is going to continue to grow, become even larger with desegregation, going back to nullification and some things with that, but also with tax protests as well to really infiltrate mainstream America. It's very important to also note that it's in this time, as mentioned earlier in maybe some of those obituaries, but it's at this time that people like Bill Gale, like Wesley Swift, began referring to each other as patriots. And along with that is also the idea of, in this time, Christian nationalism begins to be used, and it's being used by people like Swift and people like Gale. And Gale even ran on the Christian nationalist ticket, for instance. For honesty, right, and some transparency, there is a difference between evangelicals and the Christian right, who is a group that's more focused on when we're talking about the modern Republican Party and Christian identity. So, what Bill Gale is saying is not necessarily equal to an evangelical church that you might just walk into, although there's overlap with that. Christian identity's modern role as a standalone religion is, somewhat small, actually. Instead, early Christian identity leaders helped merge, again, and I keep repeating this, anti-Semitic conspiracies with other things like taxes and desegregation. And it's from there that the modern GOP is connected. I felt that it's necessary, however, to separate those two because the topic of evangelicalism, maybe in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, maybe with Reagan and that movement, while there's a lot of overlap, and today I would argue that there's so much overlap that maybe this isn't necessary, but theologically speaking, at least, those are two different things. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo a lot of what I just said, because while you could say that making a video on evangelicals and their influence on the modern GOP might be a different chore than what I'm doing here, I still argue that the overlap is extreme in at least 2023 in modern rhetoric. And I have examples, if you're watching the video here, of Donald Trump, for instance, saying that real Americans kneel to God. So insinuating that, yes, the United States is a Christian nation and those who aren't Christian are not real Americans. I have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying Christian nationalism is what America needs. And you could argue that, well, these are people that are trying to play off of maybe that evangelical wing, which is extreme in its own right, but different from maybe Bill Gale and Wesley Swift. But then I also have things from Stormfront boards, saying Christian nationalism starts by first ridding the Jews, which is something like what Bill Gale might say behind closed doors or to his adherents. We also have other things here, such as, I also want to be clear about what this is. While there is a distinction, if we're talking about maybe the theology of evangelicals and what occurred with that in the GOP and in a different time era, and what we're talking about with Bill Gale, I'm also not going to say that they're completely different. And I would very much argue that in the modern sense, they completely overlap, at least on social media and politically and with messaging. They are dog whistles. And this is, if you're watching the video, I have kind of like a collage in which you can see how they overlap, but how there's plausible deniability. So, for instance, I have one with Trump saying Americans kneel to God and God alone. So suggesting that people who don't kneel to God apparently aren't real Americans, I guess. So America is a Christian country, going back to that exceptionalism, even some of that British Israelism, if you want to go as far back as, the things we talked about before with the United States having a special covenant with God. But so there's some anti-Semitism just inherent in that. But we also have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying Christian nationalism is what America needs. And there's plausible deniability in those statements, but there isn't when you get to white power message boards. And I have one here from Stormfront, which says Christian nationalism starts by first ridding the Jews, or by Nick Fuentes, saying in this video, Fuentes supports Christian nationalism and tells non-Christians, especially Jewish people, to get out of America. He says that you serve the devil, you serve Satan. Oh, I'm anti-Semitic. Yeah, whatever. You hate Jesus, etc. Mixed in again with some plausible deniability. Representative Adam Kinzinger criticized fellow Republican Lauren Boebert on Wednesday for saying that the church is supposed to direct government and that she was tired of the two institutions being separated. Maybe there's some deniability in the anti-Semitism and the roots of what that is by saying this is evangelicalism. But then we have William Wolf here saying Christian nationalism is a sworn enemy of the World Economic Forum. The WEF promotes godless, technocratic global governments, and this is Elders of Zion. So the overlap exists much more than I think people might realize or understand. The separating of evangelicalism and the modern discussion of Christian nationalism to the Christian Nationalist Party that Bill Gale ran on is not so great nowadays. And that's my stance and my argument. But I think that there's, some validity to that. Even looking at someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying Christian nationalism is what America needs, you could be saying, well, yeah, that's one thing, but what Nick Fuentes is saying is another thing. But, then the two actually meet at the extremist version of CPAC. So the overlap exists, and I don't think that artificial barriers or silos need to be made. The Christian nationalism aside and the Christian identity preachers running on that ticket, merging it with activist organizations, Christian Defense League, as well as paramilitary organizations, does lead us down some roads that don't necessarily get to where this video is going, but that need to be involved in the broader story of this. And so Christian identity is oftentimes, it feels as if it's diminished or dismissed. But as we see, it's hugely influential. And we'll see with Bill Gale, it really is the foundation. It's what brought everything together for the modern GOP. But Christian identity, even as a standalone, has been hugely significant on the right. And here I have a slide from another video that I've done previously on Eric Rudolph. Eric worked in mentorship with Dan Gayman, a Christian identity preacher, who was actually cited in that previous paper that we looked at. Rudolph set off bombs at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, a gay club, and multiple women's clinics throughout the South. The key thoughts for him, his worldview, was casting so-called egalitarians, or people seeking equality, as Marxist totalitarians. They are communists. They are coming for guns, right? It's gun rights. It's anti-feminism, anti-globalist, because globalist is globalism and these conspiracies around that. One world order conspiracies. These are all what we've seen to this point. These are all things that people like Bill Gale was talking about in the 1950s, lumping it all together in the 1990s now into generalizations as being anti-socialist, right? Anti-one world government, anti-globalist. This is what Marjorie Taylor Greene was tweeting about, the globalists, right? This is what you see every day on Twitter. But this is also significant too, because the 1990s are the bridge to what we're going to see later pop up with, I guess, the Tea Party era, in which groups and organizations like the Oath Keepers really come to the forefront again. They borrow a lot of their ideas from this era, and in turn borrowed a lot of their ideas from that of the things that we've talked about to this point. Randy Weaver is another excellent example of this, right? So I have his time of death, 2022 here too, just to show how recently, how current this individual was. And he's often portrayed as a martyr, and we're going to show that. But both he and his wife were adherents to Christian identity. He also believed that the apocalypse was imminent, which is somewhat of a feature from within Christian identity, not necessarily mainstay. It's not something that needs to be there, but it's often wrapped up in it, right? He ran for sheriff on a radical Posse Comitatus platform. We talked about the Posse Comitatus Act. We'll talk about the Posse Comitatus organization that Bill Gale kind of creates, another thing that he does. He was affiliated with the Aryan nations and frequented their compound. We have a quote, "Whether we live or whether we die, we will not bow to your evil commandments." He received compensation eventually for the murder of his wife and sons by federal agents. However, he is, especially during the Tea Party era, was someone that was really idealized and made into a martyr and an example of an overreaching federal government, when the truth of the matter is that he was a Christian identity adherent, like Bill Gale. He believed all the anti-Semitic things. We have a picture of him here wearing just say no to Zog, or the Zionist occupational government, which is an anti-Semitic trope, protocols of Zion, blood libel, all that horrible stuff. He was a white supremacist, and he essentially created an issue. He created this conflict with the federal government, but that's not how it's portrayed within right-wing circles. And here there's many screenshots talking about things from Getter, for instance. Most of these are from Getter. Remember Ruby Ridge. This is from 2022. Waco, comparing it to what happened with Donald Trump in Florida. We have people say, how can Chinese people not know about Tiananmen Square? But there are Americans who don't even know about Waco and Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge, again, never forget Ruby Ridge, 2022. 2 days ago, so this is probably a week ago now, Amen, along with Ruby Ridge, the Bundy Ranch, and the Wildlife Refuge. This is connecting what happened to that white supremacist Christian identity adherent in the 1990s, to things that occurred with the Oath Keepers and the Bundy Group in Oregon, as well as with other Bureau of Land Management disputes too, and bringing that into the modern day. So, these are here just to show you the links between, that era in the 90s and the Christian identity stuff, and and ideas within the right today. These are some other examples. Timothy McVeigh, of course, cited Ruby Ridge as clear evidence that the U.S. government aimed to disarm the public and take away people's Second Amendment rights. Timothy McVeigh exploding the federal building in Oklahoma City, the largest domestic terrorist attack to that point in U.S. history. Ex-Oath Keepers spokesperson warns right-wing propaganda is more dangerous than bullets, and he also talks about Ruby Ridge as well. It's just interesting, again, talking about the significance of Christian identity and how it's kind of left out of the story. Even with the influence that Ruby Ridge had on people in the 90s and how that in turn impacted groups like Three Percenters and Oath Keepers later, but even to this day on platforms like Gab and Getter and Parler, people romanticize and idealize these people from the right. But the idea in which the worldview that created that scenario in the first place was steeped itself from within Christian identity and the ideas that Wesley Swift, Bill Gale were talking about at this time, not only about anti-Semitism, but the merging of it into anti-communism and tax evasion too. Now we're going to jump to one of the other formative events. We've talked a lot about communism and communist, how the Red Scare and communism in this time was combined with anti-Semitism, and how folks like Bill Gale really jumped on that to create political organizations as well as paramilitaries around that. But the next seminal event that anti-Semites and racists leveraged, aside from the Cold War, was the civil rights movement. And concurrent with the Red Scare was the civil rights movement of the 1950s. In 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981 to end segregation in the armed services. In 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American, is murdered in Mississippi. In 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus for a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is one of 60 Black pastors and civil rights leaders who meet to coordinate nonviolent protests against discrimination in Atlanta. However, for people like Bill Gale and Wesley Swift, this is just another opportunity to bring more into the fold. We already have the anti-communist side taken. Now we're going to mix that with desegregation. It was the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education which introduced anti-Semites, conspiracists, racists, and anti-communists to a much broader swath of the American population. It is here that states' rights, with roots in white supremacy dating to nullification and tax protesters, will enter into the right-wing mixture, along with concerned citizen groups and a more mainstream audience. Citizens' councils sprung up after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. They were associated with white supremacist and segregationist organizations. The first was named the Citizens Council of America, again, tying it to common people and patriotism, the flag. The organizations used numerous tactics, ranging from economic boycott to straight out violence. The argument for segregation was framed using language from the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, but warped them. An example might be the use of natural rights being implemented to discuss racial separation as being natural. And of course, the linchpin to all of this, states' rights from within nullification doctrine, as expressed by Calhoun, who we spoke about very early on in the video. So the network of segregationists and white supremacists kind of sprung up, and all these councils began forming. They offered recommendations. Some of the reading lists contained entries such as that of Patrick Henry Society of Georgia, Patrick Henry being a Revolutionary War hero. So the Patrick Henry Society of Georgia, whose letterhead stated, communism is Judaism, internationalism is Judaism, Judaism is Bolshevism. So we still see that anti-Semitism combined with, and all the global conspiracies tied to communism, making its way into citizens' councils, which are being formed for the racial integrity or segregation, right? Integrationists were depicted as Jewish communists. So, this is when the Democratic Party, as stated before, begins to be depicted as, troublemakers, as being elites, and this is when the canard of Jewish global elites and cabals began to enter into that picture as well. Black people were portrayed as being ignorant and, kind of ignorant pawns to the conspiring elites, who were, of course, Jewish, and whose goals were to destroy white civilization. White civilization was going to be destroyed by integration. It's interesting because, that argument about the introduction of a different race, destroying your civilization, it's essentially replacement theory in what Tucker Carlson talks about today to his humongous viewership. U.S. Representative John Bell Williams from Mississippi coined the term Black Monday on the floor of Congress in 1954. And it had to do in reaction to the Supreme Court's decision about Brown v. Board. Mississippi Circuit Court Judge Tom P. Brady wrote a book with the same name. Black Monday introduced new people to segregationist causes and launched the Citizens Council movement. So the Citizens Councils sprung up, but they eventually become a movement that is going to spread all of this anti-Semitic conspiracy, hate, and racism to huge, broader audience of concerned citizens in the suburbs. Among other deeply racist and segregationist content that this book contained, it suggested a 49th state meant only for African Americans, and that integration meant the loss of white civilization. And quotes, "Whenever and wherever the white man has drunk the cup of the black hemlock, whenever and wherever his blood has infused with the blood of black man, the white man, his intellect and his culture has died." It's replacement theory. It's the stuff that we see on Fox News discussed as nor as if it were normal. And it's also people, if we want to talk about the populist left and Glenn Greenwald and Matei, all these people that will go on the platforms like that, but not challenge that inherent bigotry and racism. And so organizations began spreading, and some of these organizations were had origin with extremists like Bill Gale, for instance. However, others sprung up from those. And as these expanded, it's like playing the game telephone. Ideas changed, and then from that organization, a new one kind of sprang up, and this is beginning the kind of mainstreaming or the phenomenon of like worried citizen organizations. The citizens councils spread throughout the country, and other ones popped up, specifically the Worried Citizens Council, for instance. And then there are others that seemed more benign, like the Mothers League of Little Rock Central High School. Organizations disrupted school board meetings. They protested and petitioned politicians to stop school integration. The Mothers League succeeded in suing the school district, resulting in a temporary freeze on the plans to integrate. And if you're watching the video, there are some images here of the Citizens Council of America. The theme states in the board behind the speaker, the theme, "How shall we educate our children?" And so it's a concerned group, and you could see husbands, mothers, people in the suburbs began joining these things. Above this is another screenshot from a Citizens Council newsletter, and it's in the very front. It says "A Southern Viewpoint" with a Confederate flag, and the top it has "Interposition of Nullification." And interposition is something we're going to talk about later. It's tied to nullification, but this goes back to John C. Calhoun and everything we talked about with that. It was posed as something somewhat separate from what we talked about with British Israelism and serpent seed doctrine. Now those are combining. And this is, again, the important time, the 1950s and the 1960s. In this same newsletter, there's a very racist depiction of an African-American person with a spear, big lips, the traditional stereotypes. Again, if you're watching the video, this was put out by the Mothers League of Little Rock Central High School. Again, it seems, innocent enough. It states, do you want Negroes in our schools? If you do not, then go to the polls this coming Monday. So it's essentially, saying people that you must vote, right? You must vote to stop this integration because, what's going to happen if our white children mix? It states, this is the simple truth. If the integrationists win this school board fight, the schools will be integrated this fall. There will be absolutely nothing you or we can do to stop it. Recall that it's in this time that the Democratic Party starts being called, the party of the Jewish Bolshevists, right? The communists that are forcing this unnatural, mixing of races, going to nullification, the idea that states don't need to listen to the federal government if it's in violation of the Constitution or founding documents, arguments such as, natural rights or the state of nature, which are included in the Declaration of Independence, being used as arguments that the separation of races are natural and that this is somewhat breaching those contracts. I have here a slide again from the Eric Rudolph PowerPoint, the right-wing terrorist from the 1990s, because he discussed this as well in his prison writings, and he talked about how awful it was, everything in that. He was always the victim, like all murderers are, but he talks about how awful it was when he had to move and go to this public school because there are many African Americans there. And he just talked about, how awful they were to the white children and himself. But in that mixture also came a lot about the communist Marxist teachers, specifically one who was Native American. And so, she would talk about, I have a quote here from Eric Rudolph, at least once a week, we were treated to another exhibition of Indian artifacts, which launched yet another lesson about the evil white people. And what the sentiments that Eric is discussing. So he was active in the 1990s. He was going to school shortly after a lot of the things that we just saw were happening. He's the 70s, but well within Bill Gale's range of influence. He begins mixing, like many people did, the idea of school desegregation being bad and hurting white people specifically, along with, I guess, what we could call the modern idea of cultural Marxism, which is itself anti-Semitic, but leaving the anti-Semitism out of that. The idea that there is this larger conspiracy, right, against whatever you want to say, Christian patriots, but at the end of the day, we're talking about white people. And the juxtaposition to that, what he talked about in his experience, to what we've seen more recently with things like critical race theory, for instance. All of the protests, all of the organizations, all of the very well-organized messaging, the well-organized protests, and the boots on the ground to get people into PTA meetings, into Board of Education meetings, into town hall meetings, to just spew what is ultimately conspiracies based in the things that we've talked about publicly over make-believe moral, outrage, moral pandemic, we could say. The template for what happened with critical race theory comes from the era of people like Mothers League of Little Rock Central High School. There's a direct line. And I'm looking at one here about critical race theory, Citizens for Renewing America. So very patriotic. And next to their statement, their policy issue statement for critical race theory is the hammer and sickle. And so this is it's a direct line from this era in the 50s and the 60s that we're talking about, in which Christian identity leaders created anti-Semitic conspiracy, put that into communism, took communism, and said that desegregationists were essentially all the things that were part of those old conspiracy theories, and maybe even themselves are communists and therefore Jewish, right? It's taking everything from that era and just repackaging it into the modern era. There's another screenshot here from the Heritage Action for America organization. The background information states that critical race theory makes race the lens through which its proponents analyze all aspects of American life. CRT underpins identity politics, an ongoing effort to reimagine the United States as a nation driven by racial groups, each with specific claims to victimization. So rewinding that statement, what this is saying is that the United States is actually not a country that is driven by racial issues, in which there are specific people and demographics who can claim victimization. And that saying that is this theory that is not actually based in reality, right? This one was specifically interesting, the 1776 Project Pack, because it actually, when you go on the site, you have a pop-up that comes up and it says, report a school promoting critical race theory, in which you can actually you can go ahead and self-report schools that might be teaching U.S. history, essentially. But these are very well put together, presentations and websites. The materials printed are glossy, well produced. It's because this is not the first time that this has happened. There's been decades of this. And ultimately, where does this stuff come from? It comes from the era of the Citizens Council. It comes from the era of the Worried Citizens Council. It comes from the era of the Mothers League of Little Rock Central High School. And it comes from the issues that white suburban people had with their sons and daughters going to school with Black children. So we've talked about the significance that Christian identity had in the initial forming of the Christian Nationalist Party, Christian Defense League, paramilitaries, and then how that was rolled into the creation of citizens councils, which were initially created by Bill Gale, right? That Christian identity influence. And so all of the baggage, all the anti-Semitic conspiracies, the anti-communism and racism comes along with that. And that's almost like, one piece of the Venn diagram. And now this is kind of another piece. It's not separate, it overlaps, but it's somewhat parallel, right? And that's the populist resistance to desegregation, because this is when we're going to get into the nullification doctrine again. But this is also where we're going to go to that Posse Comitatus Act that said that the federal government cannot use soldiers to enforce law. And we know that came from Reconstruction, right? It was a win for Southern white supremacists, and it returned home rule to the South and essentially started the era of Jim Crow and black codes. That's now going to be brought back up, and emerging force, along with the general, worried citizens groups and things like that I discussed, is going to be Posse Comitatus organizations. But first, we need to talk about what happened during desegregation to get there. So the populist resistance to desegregation, and that is how it was framed. It was framed as a rebellion against a tyrannical, overarching federal government intervening in schools. So September 23rd, 1957, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10730, which included placing Arkansas National Guard under federal control and sending 1,000 U.S. Army paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division to assist in restoring order in Little Rock. Of course, the Little Rock Nine were among the first children to take part in school integration and all of the protests and violence that surrounded that event. Other instances, okay, that are going to bring this all together. September 30th, 1962, Ole Miss was to be integrated with the inclusion of African-American student James Meredith, a veteran, setting off riots. When Meredith tried to register on September 20th, 1962, he found the entrance to the office blocked by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. And this type of performative populist behavior is going to be seen also with George Wallace. This riot that occurred involved over 100 arrests and multiple deaths. And I feel like this is, the Little Rock Nine in my life experience has been something that's taught. This, not so much. And this actually resulted in deaths of people. These are images that I grabbed from a website called the observationpoint.com. So I want to give that person credit. It looked like kind of like a blog or something. But these are images from Ole Miss. And you can see, if you're watching the video, from maybe the top left, we have young students, one dressed in Civil War garb with a Confederate flag. Below that, we have more students kind of like out in the quad with a large Confederate flag. We have riot police using tear gas. And then on the top, we have more riot police, National Guard, etc., arresting students. And the caption here says, "A few pictures of white patriots," because these are patriots again. Don't forget that. Now, by this time, that term is now being used on the regular, right? These are the patriots. So a few pictures of white patriots in open rebellion against the Brown v. Board of Education decree that school desegregation will occur with all deliberate speed. Moving on in this timeline of populist resistance to desegregation, there's the infamous photo of George Wallace standing and blocking the door, essentially like what we just saw in Mississippi. President Kennedy also issued an executive order which federalized the Alabama National Guard to protect and allow for African-American students Vivian Malone and James Hood entrance to the University of Alabama. Governor George Wallace blocked the entrance and infamously stated, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Wallace's speechwriter, Asa Carter himself, was a member of the KKK. Seizing on these events, Bill Gale, again, the Christian identity preacher, who ran on the Christian nationalist ticket, Constitution Party candidate, framed the use of federal force to ensure implementation of desegregation law as a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act discussed earlier. It's the exact same argument made by Calhoun in regarding nullification, but it's for the same purpose as well, right? Posse Comitatus, not allowing marshals to use federal troops to implement federal law, which is Reconstruction of the South, and therefore handing over home rule to the South, bringing back Jim Crow and black codes, right? This is the same thing. It's just in the 1950s and 60s, and it's talking about school desegregation. So Bill Gale kind of jumps on this, and he has this idea about Posse Comitatus and what that could possibly become. Bill Gale is thinking about this, and he reinterprets the Posse Comitatus Act into something that's going to be wildly influential. He reimagines it in the publication that he puts out called Identity. He says that the county sheriff is the only legal law enforcement officer in the United States. Sheriffs can mobilize non-military members to create a Posse Comitatus. If a sheriff refused to act, he could be removed from office, or citizens could form their own Posse Comitatus. Citizens can arrest officials enacting illegal laws and convene citizen juries. So this is just packed with information. And it does have, when you get into the message boards and you get into the nitty gritty, we'll see that there some other things with it. It can go back to English common law as well, but it does go directly to this idea of nullification. It goes to the idea that states don't need to listen to the federal government. It pushes it a little bit further into this, what will become the idea of constitutional sheriffs that we'll talk about, but also the idea that just citizens on their own can create their own posses if the sheriff refuses to act. And this is the birth of the militia movement. It says that citizens can arrest officials enacting illegal laws and convene citizen juries. This can also be traced to the idea that citizens can just remove elected officials. And while this begins mainly in the tax protest movements with IRS agents, I mean, there is an indirect line to what we see today with election denialism. These ideas, such as the sheriff being the highest power, right, in the United States, had direct ties to the sovereign citizens movement. It was initially wrapped up in QAnon, although when you go on ACOON boards now, it's kind of put to the side. But it was central to 3%ers and Oath Keepers. The scenario played out with Ammon Bundy's rejection to end the Oregon standoff in 2017. Bundy and Oath Keepers and other armed militiamen occupied the U.S. Wildlife Refuge in Oregon over land disputes, and the arrest of Dwight Hammond Jr. and his son for setting fire to federal land. A deal was offered to Ammon Bundy, which he declined because he claimed the FBI had no standing and that the agents would need to be deputized to become sheriffs to negotiate back to the constitutional sheriff again. So that's just a direct, mindset correlation with Ammon Bundy saying you need to be deputized or else you have essentially no power over what's happening here. Talking about this, so I have a screenshot of just a number of different organizations. The New Sons of Liberty Freeman Militia, so this is going into the militia movement. We have Ammon Bundy here, but also Aryan Nations, and so out and out white supremacist organizations also clinged on to this idea of Posse Comitatus. I have a random screenshot here, a 4chan poll. It states that you have declared yourself a sovereign citizen, right? I mean that the freemen, so freemen such as the Liberty Freemen's Militia or Montana Freemen, etc., are not cucks to the government, right? And then ultimately in the lower portion, January 6th, people on trial, or January Sixers, it's called here, are using sovereign citizen defenses to try and get out of prison. So one part of the Posse Comitatus is this idea of sovereign citizen. Another part of Posse Comitatus directly feeds into the idea of the militia movement. And within the militia movement, of course, there's different subsects of that, whether we're talking about like the Aryan Nations or the Montana Freemen or the Oath Keepers more recently. And then we also have these other ideas talked about by people like Ammon Bundy about how he's occupying a territory, and that he's not going to negotiate with anyone unless they're deputized, going to that concept of constitutional sheriff. So I'm going to talk about constitutional sheriffs, in a moment. But with Posse Comitatus and Bill Gale, some bullet points: federal intervention in education and schools, desegregation, the Federal Reserve System, part of the identity movement, and Jewish conspiracies about international banking, etc. Unconstitutional actions of the judiciary, which is desegregation, Brown v. Board of Education, violations of natural law. That would be separation of races. So integration was a violation of natural law found in the founding documents. And the United States Christian Posse Association, which kind of formed out of this in 1972. And there were other, kind of organizations that came from it as well. I have the Minutemen here, and the Minutemen coming, associated with the Patriotic Party. So this kind of comes out of Posse Comitatus. It's a little bit of a side quest, but It was founded by Robert Depew. He was a nativist and anti-communist. The organization stockpiled weapons and engaged in paramilitary training. Depew founded the Patriot Party, and again, it's Patriot. By this point, we're in the mid-'60s, and this term has already been co-opted by extremists. He skipped bail after federal firearms charges and was a fugitive, being arrested in 1970. While a fugitive, Depew published letters warning of Black militants who would send terror squads into white suburbs and rural areas to create chaos. And that language, of course, is directly reminiscent of what was occurring on things like Fox News during Black Lives Matter protests, right? The fear was always that these mobs of angry Black people would somehow get to the suburbs. He also advocated for something, total resistance. There's also a concept, massive resistance, which is its own unique thing. But he advocated for total resistance and to not register firearms, but fight the communists instead. And so, this is all, again, formative to the militia movement that's going to come, formative to the 90s. But if we're talking more about today, the Oath Keepers and eventually what happened with January 6th. So again, the idea of Posse Comitatus is so important and so broad. But one example of how this plays out. I have an article here. It's from NBC. It's entitled "Former Oath Keeper Has Trained Texas Law Enforcement for More Than 80 Departments." And this is somebody who is prolific, right, with the Oath Keepers and this idea of constitutional sheriffs. It states that retired Arizona Sheriff Richard Mack, a former board member of the Oath Keepers, teaches county sheriffs that they are more powerful than the FBI and even the President of the United States. Mack, who founded the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, maintains that the U.S. Constitution gives local law enforcement officers powers to block federal officials and even powers to personally determine whether laws are constitutional. So this is just one manifestation that shows the crossover, right? That the Venn diagram being formed of what we've talked about to this point, leading to the concept of Posse Comitatus, right, from an anti-Semitic preacher, and how that in turn led to the concept of constitutional sheriffs being adopted by really the main antagonist in January 6th, if we're being honest, the most organized at the event, Oath Keepers, by a member of the Oath Keeper organization who is teaching this false ideology to active law enforcement officers, and what repercussions that has onto the broader society. This is especially true when we think to the Oath Keepers data leak that unmasked members of the Oath Keepers and just how many active military and law enforcement officers were in those roles that were made public. Along with the somewhat focused concept of constitutional sheriff that came from Posse Comitatus, which came from Bill Gale, the Christian identity preacher who merged all of this, is the idea of nullification, which we've discussed, right? We talked about nullification and John Calhoun and where that came from and what that means. Crossover between Oath Keepers and the Tea Party is vital to understand kind of how the MAGA movement occurred. The Tea Party movement is what legitimized and began to institutionalize what was previously more fringe, say in the 1990s, movements like the militia movement, the Patriot movement, individuals like Eric Rudolph, for example, Timothy McVeigh, and where they got their ideas from. The Tea Party is what brought those fringe elements via populism into one of the two major parties in the United States in a significant manner. And with that came Oath Keepers. And with Oath Keepers came a lot of these ideas of Posse Comitatus. And so here is just one, and this could be a video as well on its own, but here's one example. Tea Party Boise backs nullification. Idaho's most active Tea Party group is urging members to help bring a crowd of at least 1,000 to next week's hearing on House Bill 59, which seeks to allow Idaho to deem federal law null and void, including last year's healthcare law. This is a line in the sand, says a notice from Tea Party Boise. On the one side, federal tyranny. On the other side is freedom. What do you choose? If it is freedom, then be at the Capitol. And this is exactly what Bill Gale created in opposition to school desegregation. That's where this comes from. And calling the organizations which sprung, the Posse Comitatus, going back to the Posse Comitatus Act, that is steeped in Reconstruction, as we know, and essentially the home rule of the South, Jim Crow, Black codes. It's based in racism. Nullification, John C. Calhoun, is based in the idea of protecting slavery as an institution. Right? That's where this comes from. And if you weren't around during this time, the narratives around the healthcare debate were eerily similar in talking about communism, socialism, and African-American presidents, and all of the things, right, that are based around that, which is a different topic, but which all stem and pull from this 1950s, 1960s era of Bill Gale, and really drawing all of these things from Christian identity to segregationists to anti-communism. We'll get to tax protests, but now in Posse Comitatus, all this together to form what today is really kind of just a normal, you can go on Twitter and see folks tweeting this stuff every day, and it's become normalized and mainstreamed. And unfortunately, I hit my paywall for the Missoulian, which is too bad. But behind the paywall, behind the white, it talks about how the local police department had to drop Oath Keeper affiliated training. So that's just how deep. Yes, there were members, but you could claim people might not understand what the organization is about. Yes, there are people talking about voting on nullification, but that's about healthcare. That's not about race. There's always this plausible deniability. But this article, unfortunately, I'm not going to pay for it, but behind the paywall, you can check it out. The Missoulian talks about how their police department was literally using Oath Keeper training for their policing force. I do have here yet another article, and again, there are many, just showing so that you can see it's not a one-off. Mississippi nullification panel pushed by Tea Party legislators would negate federal laws. This comes from Posse Comitatus. This comes from everything that we've talked about to this point. Robert Depew is another important figure in all of this. He was a nativist and anti-communist. His organization stockpiled weapons and engaged in paramilitary training. Depew also founded the Patriotic Party in 1966, kind of building on the idea of what happened earlier with Wesley and Gale, the California Rangers, etc. He skipped bail after federal firearms charges and was a fugitive until being arrested in 1970. And while a fugitive, Depew published letters warning of Black militants who would send terror squads into white suburbs and rural areas to create chaos. And this is the narrative for the Turner Diaries, which influenced Timothy McVeigh, of course, and many other horrible people. But this is also the same narrative that was used for Antifa and Black Lives Matter under Donald Trump. 3%ers, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, we're fomenting this fear, of course. He advocated for a total resistance and to not register firearms, but to instead fight communists. The Liberty Lobby is interesting because it's a nice crossover. Robert Depew was a member, is organized back in '58, but lasted all the way up until 2001. It described itself as a pressure group of patriotism because, of course, these people are patriots, right? And presented itself as a patriotic populist organization. So again, this infusion of populism as well, this early on. It promoted anti-Semitic conspiracies, white nationalism, and Holocaust denial. So, yeah, their publication entitled The Spotlight used populist messaging to reach more moderate conservatives, though, and in some cases, centrist and even liberals. It dabbled in topics as abstract as alternative medicine, and in many ways, I feel like is a forerunner to what we saw during COVID and what we see today on social media platforms like Twitter, in which you have people that are just populists that dabble and play footsie with right-wing extremism, but then might also talk about alternative medicine regarding COVID, say. So while that's interesting, Robert Depew is really important to this narrative because after his arrest, many of his followers joined Gale and inspired the Posse Comitatus movement. This, along with interest from the John Birch Society members and tax protest movement, grew the movement well beyond Christian identity congregations and into more mainstream audiences. The Posse Comitatus movement had far-reaching influence on events that occurred after the 60s into the 70s and 80s, 90s, but as well as ideas and concepts still in use today by the modern right. One example out of many, but just one because of the person involved, is the Cutina County Christian Posse Comitatus, who attempted to arrest a police officer that was set to testify against a member. The marshal of this organization, this group, was Richard Butler, who would go on to establish the Aryan Nations. This idea of Posse Comitatus, again, coming from Bill Gale, the Christian identity preacher, and everything that goes along with that, infiltrated farm protesters as well, with the establishment of the American Agricultural Movement, or the AAM. The American farmer, 20th century slave, repackaged the same tropes of the Elders of Zion, and the movement focused on Jewish Vice President Nelson Rockefeller as being one of the key conspirators with international bankers and elites against the farmer. In quotes, an international Jew Bolshevik cartel. Posse Comitatus was a forerunner to the sovereign citizen movement and everything associated with that, the Oath Keeper Bundy Bureau of Land Management disputes, and militia ideology from the 1990s going all the way up until January 6th. And if you don't believe me about these direct connections going all the way up to January 6th, I have here a Southern Poverty Law Center article titled Nullification Conference Attracts Far-Right Extremists. And in this article, it says, we were there when Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes warned that the federal government was laying the groundwork to freely kill American citizens. So here he is at the Nullification Conference. Another idea with nullification and kind of a mixture of nullification and Posse Comitatus is the idea of interposition. And that's for another video. I bring it up, though, because sometimes in doing research or looking through various social media platforms, interposition is used as a way to kind of express the same sentiments in these ideas that we've been talking about. So, for instance, here we have Sheriff defies FBI, interposition for all gun owners in his jurisdiction. So this is basically nullification or Posse Comitatus, in that the sheriff is the most important person in the land. You can ignore federal law, or the state can. Above that, the interposition part 1, what we can do to thwart federal communist tyranny. I include that because it's just that mixture of communism. And then on the left, there's a larger comment that talks about this, and it's very populist in language. Our rulers hate our history and despise us, and we can't save the whole country, but et cetera, et cetera. Down at the bottom, though, the link that's posted is Movements, the Future for White Americans. And this is not, because it kind of brings it all together, the idea of who are real Americans, white people, who is the enemy, the communists, which are, Jewish Bolshevists, of course. It's just Bill Gale's Christian identity stuff, wrapped up in this idea of sheriffs defying the FBI. But it's just a different term, interposition. There's historical language with that. I'm not going to go into it for this video, but I wanted to bring that to light. moving with this and in doing research, this was interesting to me. Is a little bit outside of the main source that I was using, but with going down the road of nullification or posse comitatus or even constitutional sheriff, possibly, you get to interposition, but then from interposition you also get to the doctrine of lesser magistrates, which is just the unspooling of the idea set forth in Posse Comitatus by Bill Gale. But this is interesting because it also begins to bring in the idea of Christianity too. In a way, it's almost going full circle back to Christian identity, not in the out and out anti-Semitism, even though that's inferred with the globalist language and things like that, but with the idea of it not purely being constitutional in argumentation. And we can see that here. The lesser magistrate doctrine is rooted in the historical Christian doctrine of interposition. Again, that's even something else that's separate. But it is interesting that this is the way that the movement has unfolded, and this really blew up with COVID and with mandates. And it's interesting because even going back to like the Liberty Lobby and some of those organizations, how they might try to mix things like alternative medicine. There are ways to mainstream this messaging that occurred in the 60s and 70s that were just redone in the 2000s. And here I just have a collage of different things that I found: movies, YouTube videos, posts from Gab and other platforms, but they all have to do with COVID and this combination of COVID with Christianity and interposition. And the movie's called is a non-compliant movie. You probably heard of that. We have DeSantis in the bottom talking about interposition by state governor for dropping vaccine mandates. The doctor of lesser magistrate, but within the idea of like this Christian presentation of it regarding the CDC and COVID. So this is just the latest iteration of the same stuff. I mean, this is the same stuff that we've been talking about with going to Bill Gale. It's my opinion, though, that yes, while the militia movement has been mainstreamed, and you can buy 3% or bumper stickers online and walk around with what is essentially militia insignia, and it's no problem. While that's been mainstreamed and acceptable for white middle class, dad to be wearing a sweater to his son's baseball game or something. I do think that it was the tax protest that really mainstreamed or made these ideas acceptable to discuss, whether it be somewhat outright or somewhat through dog whistle and analogy. But Bill Gale was also in on tax protest. And while Posse Comitatus blew up many of the ideas that he had been previously teaching in Christian identity to a much smaller crowd, tax protest, just in my opinion, is really where it got out. It got to people's backyards. It was acceptable to say these things. I remember being young in even the 1980s and hearing people talk about things like this, using language like this, like adults around me. So Bill Gale and tax protest. Gale began publishing about tax protest in the 1960s. He supported higher profile tax protesters and used the movement to spread his anti-Semitic, racist, and anti-communist messages. Gale cross-pollinated audiences from the Christian Identity Church and the general tax protest movement. So some went one way, the others went the other way, and this is how this, along with Posse Comitatus, began to really blow up. And this was the roots of his Posse Comitatus ideology. This was the beginning of that specific cross-pollination. Tax protests were featured in Bill Gale's Christian Identity magazine, Identity. A leading figure in the movement was Arthur Porth, and Porth was arrested for not filing taxes. Gale used the trial to advance his Posse Comitatus doctrine, leveraging ideas from nullification. Gale stated, "Unless Mr. Porth is released at an early date, I fear the citizens will consider impaneling a grand jury under the authority of the Ninth Amendment, U.S. Constitution, for the purpose of indicting all officials involved. So, right, I mean, this is a very early combination of sovereign citizen, the idea of Posse Comitatus, in which if the sheriff is not doing what he needs to do, that citizens can create their own posse, and also the idea of citizen juries, right, that these can kind of just prop up. So here I have some information that the case in which Porth was involved in became somewhat infamous for tax protesters. Porth sued the federal government in Porth v. Broderick and demanded a return of his previous year's taxes. Porth explained, "You're not going to get those rights by joining some group. You're going to get those rights when you as individuals demand your individual constitutional rights." And this is part of the idea of massive resistance, right? Not specifically to that, but it's the idea of not going to the John Birch Society and joining that, but you taking initiative on your own and taking action, which sounds very much like the leaderless resistance, which was called for in the early 1990s, that spawned that militia movement, but also all of the individuals of that era. And I'm thinking specifically of Timothy McVeigh as well as Eric Rudolph. Henry E. Garrett is another figure to discuss because he was part of the Citizens Councils. And if you're watching the video, you can see to his left the emblem there, and on the other side, a Confederate flag. I have a quote from Henry E. Garrett: "The morality and legality of the tax strike is beyond any question. It is made a moral imperative by the pages of time in the white man's long struggle to retain his liberty from the ambitions of tyrants of all descriptions." And we know who those tyrants are, of course. And this quote is important because it's very early crossover, right? Showing that taxes and white grievance are directly connected. They're directly connected for a number of reasons, but in this specific example, it's coming from more of like a Christian identity, anti-Semitic point of view. But we'll see later, as this kind of expands out to the general populace, how white grievance about busing, for instance, and tax rates in towns and cities involving busing, how that is going to spur and radicalize who would otherwise be somewhat moderate or non-political middle-class white people. That quote I got from this, which is an online scan of a Citizens Council pamphlet written by Mr. Garrett, who we just talked about here, Dr. Garrett. This one's entitled "Insanity in Education, Falsehoods in Textbooks." So you can kind of see how, where this is going to go, but it's interesting. Violent insanity in public education. So it's kind of going back to that critical race theory and how all of this is beginning to mash together. But here's the image, and this is where some of the quotes are coming from. I think that the interesting thing here, though, and while there's much that we could go through, is actually kind of near the end of it. And so I'm going to go on to the bottom to the suggested reading list, because it tells you if someone were to get their hands on this, for instance, that is again maybe in the suburbs, somebody who's not totally political, but finds this about taxes. There's some really interesting things here. I'm looking at, for instance, religion, and this is now they're all over the place, right? But religion, Christianity and segregation. Why integration is unchristian. Catholic race mixing in New Orleans. Christian view on segregation. And this is how it happened. This is how it happened before the internet, right? Up on the other side, communists promote racial turmoil, right? Pro-communist record of Robert Weaver, the story of NAACP. Suggested books, Race and Reason, The Biology of Race Problems. So this is how it happens. It's, this is the mainstreaming. Now, this individual is part of the Citizens Council, which was created by Bill Gale, which comes from the Christian identity movement, which is inherently anti-Semitic, as we know. And it's leveraging desegregation, right? Desegregation to make people more active in their communities and willing to go out and possibly join organizations like the Christian Defense League. And, that is a little extreme, but there are worried citizen organizations, all these different things that started popping up at this time. And we have a member of that kind of that organization, that idea, talking about insanity in education and falsehoods, right? And he speaks a lot to taxes, but so maybe you're introduced to him by taxes. You get this, and it's going into what's essentially today the same kind of idea of critical race theory hysteria. And then you get to the suggested reading list, and that's where you get the Wesley Swift content, the Bill Gale content. It's where you get pilled, right? This is essentially an analog way of red pilling somebody. But I think it's important to show that because, again, this is coming from the confines of somebody who, in doing research, is mostly known for his stances on taxes or being a tax protester. And that's how this, in my view, that's how the modern GOP kind of has formulated in staying close enough to radical causes, right, to pill people, to bring them in and to draw attention to people who are a part of those for support, but also keeping enough, enough distance away for plausible deniability. In that periodical, for instance, Henry Garrett wasn't talking about the biology of race and intelligence or something. However, if he got to the end, you could see where he could order a book that discussed something like that. And another tax protester of this era is Irwin Schiff. And, he's interesting because he's somebody who could introduce people to maybe something like the Citizens Council, right? You read one of his books, and then it's in many ways I'm describing, these ideas of going down YouTube rabbit holes and things like that, but in analog form, in periodical. But regardless, Irwin Schiff is interesting because he's kind of like the soft, the soft red pill of this movement. And his books focus more on the federal government, but of course are steeped in everything that we've talked about to this point. And you can still buy his books today, of course. They're on Amazon as listed here. But I do have one quote that I found of his that I think speaks to what it is that we're talking about. That the middle class can emerge victorious in the battle with the central, all-engulfing tyranny. And this is what these are things that even someone like myself might have heard. Tyranny is kind of a dramatic word, but the idea, right, of a generation of people beginning to see themselves in conflict with the federal government, and that the federal government is tyrannical. That language is the language of nullification. That language is the language that came from people like Calhoun, and then later in the end of Reconstruction, the rise of Black codes and Jim Crow. That's the same language that people like Bill Gale used to broader audiences during integration of schools, right? So, the Bill Gale was a big proponent of the tax protest movement, and I can see why, because this is the entry, right? This is the entryism to those other ideas. And when we're talking about the modern Republican Party, if you're talking about taxes, tyrannical federal government, socialism, communism, critical race theory, right, wokeism, immigration, the idea that we need to go back to Christian values, this is where everything should start making sense. And when we're talking about global things, when you start getting into these global conspiracies in the populist language used by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, then it really hits home. This is the stuff that Bill Gale was working on in the 50s and 60s. This is the stew, the conglomeration of these different parts of tax protest, Posse Comitatus, desegregation, anti-communism, using the narratives and the outline of the old anti-Semitic conspiracies, right? And just repackaging it into communism or something along those lines. The people today are borrowing from that. And that was caused by everything that we've talked about so far in this video. Here's another example, which it feels like this could have been posted today by an elected representative from within the Republican Party. However, it wasn't. It was written by someone named George Hill, who was a Posse Comitatus supporter and was published in Tax Strike News decades ago, I should mention. So the quote is, "Fantastic sums of money stolen from our paychecks by an income tax law illegally foisted on the American people. The great increase in crime, fast decaying morals, drug use, pornography, and permissiveness, socialist teaching in our schools, busing, by such acts as the Occupational Safety and Health and Environmental Protection Act, the far-reaching and determined drive by leftist groups to register and outlaw guns, our sellout to the communists worldwide, and doctoring of our news in the form of a tax newsletter." And now we know. Now we know where this comes from, and now we know where the people today get it from. We've all heard disgruntled Republicans complain about their tax dollars going to druggies or to welfare queens, as Reagan famously stated, and fascistic metaphors like leeches and parasites. That the hard-earned dollars of honest workers were being taken by elites and redistributed to lazy deadbeats in exchange for votes. An anti-Semitic canard. This is where it comes from. In its place of origin, it was white grievance at federal laws and programs that were perceived to benefit African Americans at the expense of whites, especially the middle class. These arguments were often mainstreamed in legalistic or constitutional language, but were firmly rooted in anti-Semitism and racism. Inherent in these patriotic or patriot talking points was that white Christians, real Americans, were being exploited by elites in an Elders of Zion style conspiracy, and that African Americans were a burden. Most didn't say this explicitly, as to not scare away more respectable folks who could be slowly lured into the Christian identity and racist conspiracies, again, similar to being red-pilled. But some people did this anyway. Martin Larson, a tax protester, is a good example, or at least this is a good example of how the tax protest is multifaceted or double-faced. And so here we have something from the Mercury, which is very much geared more towards a hardline radical stance, saying that basically Black people in the United States are increasing. So demographic shifts, again, this is replacement, Tucker Carlson, at twice the rate as the rest of the population, and that this is going to default to a tax burden on white people. He says, unquestionably doom the American way of life, right? White people. Larson stated African-American offspring ran wild in the streets, free to forage their food in garbage cans. They grow up to be permanent relievers, criminals, rioters, looters. I mean, this is the terminology that was used with Black Lives Matter and Antifa and things around George Floyd, etc. But so this is the Mercury, and this is something that's how the topic of taxes can be used to express what are explicitly racist ideas and tropes in a way that even in this form is somewhat conventional and safe. But in the next slide, we're going to see how the same person presents this information in a different way for a broader audience. And so this is from the book Tax Revolt USA, Why and How Thousands of Patriotic Americans Refuse to Pay Their Income Tax. And you can get this on Amazon too, of course. So Martin Larson says in this version of his narrative, the federal government has become the enemy to the useful members of society. It has degenerated into a vast system of extortion and bribery. And this sounds, I wouldn't even say libertarian. This sounds like straight, run-of-the-mill Republican GOP grievances. But we can see what's behind the grievance. And in this, the focus is the federal government because they're soft pilling essentially people. But once you start talking about, well, what are we talking about with the federal government? That's when you go back here and you're saying, well, they're the problem because they're enabling basically Black people to live as rioters and criminals and looters. And the elitist aspect of that goes back to the anti-Semitic tropes, and that this is essentially going to destroy the American way of life because it's crushing the white middle class. And here, except middle class, we have patriotic Americans, right? And how can you avoid to pay? Because where is this tax money going? It's going to Head Start. It's going to food programs. Right? It's at the initial point in time, perhaps going towards desegregation efforts or busing efforts. Right? It's going to these causes that are explicitly racial in nature, but we can abstract it and just talk about the federal government now. And this is the mainstreaming. This is how you get from Bill Gale to the backyard cookout. However, to provide a counterbalance to that last statement, the tax protest movement wasn't simply a means to draw in normally apolitical centrist demographics. For example, Marvin Cooley was a tax protester and member of the John Birch Society, and his work resulted in building the foundational ideology and worldviews of Robert J. Matthews. Robert J. Matthews went on to become the founder of the neo-Nazi gang, The Order. And so Matthews was first radicalized from within the tax protest movements. So it wasn't just something that was meant to be purely a dog whistle. People did enter into that movement and come out the other side radicalized. And with that mindset in place, let's look to the tax protest to see just how radical aspects of it did become, right? We've been focusing a lot on how it was used to become a respectable platform to express racist, anti-Semitic views. But there were those like Matthews that were radicalized from it. And, Gordon Gale is a great example of that. He is another one of these figures that's been romanticized and has entered into a form of martyrdom, kind of similar to Ruby Ridge and maybe some of the 90s militia figures. Gordon Gale, 1920, 1983. He was an infamous tax protester who became radicalized by Christian identity and Posse Comitatus. There's a cult following in right-wing circles with conspiracies around his death, of course, absolving him of any wrongdoing. He was indicted for not paying income taxes in 1973 and 1974, and he was sentenced to prison. After release, he broke probation and continued to not pay taxes. He murdered 2 marshals and injured 3 in the early 1980s during an attempted arrest and became a fugitive. So he went underground, and ultimately he was shot by police later in 1983, but not before Gale fatally wounded Sheriff Harold Gene Matthews in the process. So looking on various social media sites, I found some stuff on Gab, on Parler, on Getter, the kind of go-tos. But when looking for things on Gordon Gale, again, very much seen as a martyr, and again to try to show the timeline of ideology, belief structures. There was a lot of Gordon Gale talk going back to Ruby Ridge and Randy Weaver, and how Randy Weaver was also entered into the status of a martyr. And here we have a series of Gab posts that started out with Randy Weaver, of course, pointing out the Zionist occupational government shirt, the anti-Semitic canard. They're very proud of that. So we have Randy Weaver with his Zog shirt on, and then a post below it saying they will never leave you alone, showing the Weaver compound. And then in response to that, don't forget about Gordon Gale. Gordon Gale chronology of events: life, military, tax protest, Medina shootout, and death in Arkansas. So I'm showing this just because it's not a name that perhaps many people are familiar with. However, it is, if we're talking in the lore of the right at this point, if we're talking about that chronology, that yes, we have Randy Weaver, and what he spurred later were events in Oklahoma City and later with the Olympic bombing, but also into the revival of militias with the Tea Party movement in that era too, people looking back to the 90s and the Patriot movement and militia movements, but also a hearkening back to the tax protest a little before Randy Weaver. And of course, Christian identity is wrapped up in all of this. Randy Weaver was an adherent to Christian identity. His wife was, as well as Gordon Gale. And Posse Comitatus is wrapped up in all of this, ideas of nullification and states' rights, and et cetera. So, all of this is combined. And I like this thread because it shows you the mindset and kind of like the logical pinpoints in chronology, or, oh, you're interested in that, then check out this, in a right kind of wing discussion. Again, another post, before Ruby Ridge and Waco, there was Gordon Gale, Death and Taxes, the Gordon Gale story. Death and Taxes is all over the place on these social media platforms. And here was another one. It's a little bit longer, but I posted it because it's the persecution of Yori Gale, and that was his son. His son was actually shot during one of the initial shootouts between he and police when there's an attempted arrest after his imprisonment. And just looking through this, looking at the words like tyranny and communism, organized hit squad of federales to murder these people, it becomes clear that the mythos surrounding this, that these people are seen not as white supremacists, not as bigoted racists, not as dangerous murderers, but as renegades against this tyrannical government. And it's insightful because this is, again, how many of the people in the 90s are portrayed, but it's the lore and the mythos that's being built in that period of like the 90s into the early 2000s being expressed here, right? And of course, all of that, the people that were involved in the actions and the events, that create that lore that professional politicians in the Republican Party today draw from, or people in the media today draw from the right, initiated in what we've looked at. And so here's a quote from Gordon Gale, and this is useful because we've seen the martyrdom, and we've seen him juxtaposed to Randy Weaver, and of course he's coming out of the tax protest, which again is not explicitly racist on the surface or anti-Semitic on the surface, but so here's a quote from the man that's become part of a mythos and kind of legacy in right-wing thought. So, quote, "The enemy of Christ have taken their Jewish communist manifesto and incorporated it into statutory laws of our country and through our Constitution and our Christian common law into the garbage can. We are engaged in a struggle to the death between the people of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Satan. We are a conquered and occupied nation, conquered and occupied by the Jews and their hundreds or maybe thousands of front organizations doing their ungodly work. They have two objectives in their goal of ruling the world: destroy Christianity and the white race." And this is from a handwritten letter from Gordon Gale in 1983 while he was on the run. We started this video with some images of just some tweets that I grabbed. I thought, were represented well what it is that I'm talking about. And I think that, maybe we come full circle back on that. And the Tea Party movement was very integral. It was the linchpin between the militia movement of the 90s and the ideas, and even some of the people that were involved in that, as well as the Patriot movement and other right-wing extremism, gaining entryism into institutional power of the GOP and the Republican Party. And, this was done by throwing out the quote-unquote rhinos and bringing in the populist right. And well, now we know where that comes from, right? So everything with this is kind of double-faced, and we've seen that, and we've seen the through line of how people like Bill Gale and Christian identity, were really the folks that merge these different ideas from anti-communism to racism to anti-Semitism and tax protests into something that could be repackaged and turned into something that appears to be mainstream and normal. And like, for instance, these are signed from the Tea Party, a Tea Party protest, or a number of Tea Party protests, and they're talking about taxes, and that's what the Tea Party stood for, right? TEA, taxed enough already. But behind this, just like behind the reasons for Bill Gale becoming interested and supporting and espousing tax protesters himself, behind this, of course, is the racism and the xenophobia and the anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism wrapped up in anti-communism. Right. So, and if you're listening to this in audio form, I'm just fading between one set of signs that are talking about purely financial things and taxes, very much like the tax movement focused on the federal government, if we're trying to talk to dads in the backyards of the suburbs, versus a collage of images talking about hanging President Obama, showing President Obama with a turban on his head and Hussein in quotes, the hammer and sickle next to President Obama, calling him a terrorist, and many other horrible things. The American taxpayers are the Jews for Obama's ovens by ballot or bullet. Restoration is coming. Birtherism. So again, this was just a repackaging of a tax protest that had already happened, essentially. And this time, however, instead of infiltrating the suburbs, this was infiltrating institutional power from within the Republican Party. You could argue that, this has been a slow roll, and that even, Ronald Reagan himself was an extremist and a radical, and the moral majority and all of that. It's a little bit of a different scenario, and yes, those do play a role in this. But I will show this because while it's a little bit, it's not connected directly to Bill Gale or some of the personalities we talked about. It is the sentiment and the honesty, and this is from Lee Atwater. So Lee Atwater was a strategist for the Republican Party and an advisor to U.S. Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was one of the people behind Reagan's Southern strategy in his first election. And the quote says this. This was when he was much older, apparently on his deathbed. You start out in 1954 by saying the N-word, the N-word, the N-word. He says the word, right? But the N-word, the N-word, the N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things that you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than the N-word, the N-word. And this isn't such a nice way of putting a bow on it, because aside from perhaps a Republican, perhaps Ronald Reagan saying this himself, and we know that he said a bunch of racist things too, African people wearing shoes and things like that. But this is the strategist for the Republican Party in the 80s, right? Before the Tea Party movement and MAGA. And he is admitting, he's saying what I just said, except I just broke it down and showed you incrementally how it evolved over a period of time and what pieces and byproducts were involved in it. This is much more in your face, and I'm sure that Lee Atwater wasn't aware of all the things that I talked about. But the sentiment is exactly what I talked about. Not in a specific order, because it isn't exactly A to Z. Some things we jump around a little bit to put the story together, but we started with anti-Semitic conspiracy, specifically blood libel and elders of Zion. And then we talked about Christian identity and how British Israelism kind of informed that and how that carried on some of the anti-Semitic tropes, but also, introduced that to the United States as well. And Christian identity really, it did inform and radicalize people such as Randy Weaver or such as Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber. But really, Bill Gale and his role in that was to bring all this together into something that could then later be touched or picked on or repackaged into a new modern reincarnation. Nullification doctrine based in white supremacy and Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws. We have the Posse Comitatus Act, and what that means on different levels, along with nullification, with states' rights and interposition, and how tax protests kind of played into that. But then ultimately, the Posse Comitatus groups that formed, and the constitutional sheriff idea, and the sovereign citizens idea, and the militia movement, how all those came from or were informed by this center. We had the Cold War and McCarthyism and the role that played in everything, essentially taking what were overtly anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes about global cabals of Jewish people working behind the scenes against white Christians and transitioning that into Judeo-Bolshevism, or maybe just outright plain old socialism, or the globalists, right? Anti-Semitic conspiracy and communist packaging, going all the way up through the 90s into the Tea Party. And I can't stress enough the significance of the Tea Party when it comes to legitimizing everything that came before it. All of the fringe things that came before it were now normalized. And that's what enabled MAGA to happen. That's what enabled a birther Donald Trump conspiracy candidate to win in his effort to the presidency. And of course, laying the groundwork for January 6th insurrection. So from global conspiracy, from anti-Semitic tropes transformed into populist messaging, to states' rights arguments based in white supremacy framed as rebellion, to militias and sovereign citizen ideology, again, portrayed as rebellion steeped in segregation and ultimately Jim Crow, and tax protests stemming from funds supporting integration and the welfare state perceived to be assisting minorities. And when we go back and we look at the initial screenshots that we started with, if you didn't already know these things, looking at them now, we have to be more critical. When we see an elected official for the Republican Party posting things about the globalist cabal, that's not a dog whistle. That's, at this point in evolution of these ideas, overtly telling you what they think. When we see people talking about vengeance for the Lord, right? God will not let evil go unpunished. And talking about the uniparty globalists, that's not a dog whistle either. That is overtly telling you, this is directly coming from the things that we just talked about. This could have been a Bill Gale sermon. When we have, who is now the Speaker of the House of Representatives, tweeting things about Jewish men buying elections, maneuvering from behind the scenes with a hashtag MAGA. We know what this means. Again, this is not trickery. And that person knows what it means as well. It is not as if they are ignorant. The right has been telling us who they are for a long time. And, we need to really start believing that. We need to start taking them at face value. There's a lot of discussion in the modern times about populist messaging and perhaps even working with the right. This is not an alliance that you want to enter into, right? The populist messaging is not based in the same material critiques from which I hope most of you are coming from regarding economic disparity, for instance. Their critiques are coming from what we just explained. It's coming from many different things, granted, but heavily, largely, from that era in time, in the 1950s and the 1960s, where communism, racism, antisemitism, taxes, all came together to form mothers groups, to form proto-militias, to form third parties, right? To engage in many different ways a very extreme message, but beginning to be built for moderate, widespread consumption. And there are even some people today that will try to say that a literal insurrection, which is in many ways the culmination of everything that we talked about, it is really the culmination of all these different things. It's almost a natural progression in a way to get to this point, and there's a lot more to it. But there are people that deny that this was anything, and there are people that will say these were just a bunch of folks that were there, taking pictures and selfies, and that they were harmless. These folks weren't harmless, and the Oath Keepers involved were extremely organized. And the Oath Keepers that were involved, as well as other militias, were well armed and had caches of weapons outside of the area. And, we know this because it's in their messages to each other, right? We know this. It's public. But to speak to the mainstreaming, how extreme the Republican Party has become, in a resolution to censor Liz Cheney for daring to investigate this, for daring to investigate an insurrection and what the people that might have been involved with that. The Republican Party says this. First, that of course Democrats are socialists, right? They want to replace liberty with socialism. They want to steal the American dream from the children. We should all know what this means now, right? But the most important part is this, is that it was legitimate political discourse. And that's absolute insanity. That the Republican Party has become so extreme that they would willingly publish something that's public facing, stating that what happened on January 6th was somehow legitimate. But that's where we're at. And we know why we're there, because this party, what we have today, is informed by all the things that we just discussed. We also know about the extremist elements in this because we've seen the timeline of events. We know the Oath Keepers being involved with constitutional sheriffs and training police officers, and how that's based in Posse Comitatus. Posse Comitatus being an idea by Bill Gale, who is a Christian identity preacher. These are direct lines. These aren't just conspiracies and things being tagged up on the wall. This is a direct progression of ideology becoming more and more accepted. And we know that these people meant it. We know that because they were found guilty of sedition. And so whether it's Tucker Carlson, or whether it's Jimmy Dore, or whether it is Marjorie Taylor Greene, whomever is peddling this right-wing extremist populist view, saying these people were just there to have fun, are ignoring a finding by a jury that states Elmer Stuart Rhodes III, the founder and leader of the Oath Keepers, and Kelly Meigs, the leader of the Florida chapter of the organization, were found guilty by a jury today of seditious conspiracy. They committed sedition. And ultimately, if you want to go back to the Turner Diaries, if you want to go back to Timothy McVeigh, if you want to go back to Eric Rudolph, if you want to go back to Bill Gale, this is the project. Right? This is the project. This has nothing to do with democracy, has nothing to do with compromise. This has to do with very racist, anti-Semitic-based ideologues taking power because they believe that they are righteous and that power belongs to them. That's the right-wing extremist view, and that's the Republican view for many people, for many members of the party, whether you want to talk about topics from CPAC or if you want to talk about the party putting out something to the press to read that says that this was legitimate public political discourse. Sedition, as found by a jury, is legitimate. And it's always just one step away. You can find this on Twitter nowadays, but behind Twitter, if you go to Gab or you go to these other sites, it's all right there for you. Majority Taylor Greene can talk about the globalist cabal on Twitter, and then these accounts can talk about death to the big Jew globalist deep state on Gab, right? Whether or not there's whatever plausible deniability you want to include, whether you want to say it's extreme overlap 90% or it's just the same thing, it doesn't matter, because the origins and the ideas come from the same place and the sentiments is the same. And I know this because you can always just go on the Stormfront and get the answer, right? You know, there's always the plausible deniability if you're talking about globalism. No, that's globalization. That's actually against the corporate. No. What happened with the anti-globalization process in the 90s have nothing to do with this. This is totally separate. And so go to the source to find out, find the truth, because here they're not putting up the walls, right? This is like reading what we showed before with taxes about how in one instance it's the federal government being tyrannical. In the other instance, it's because minority people are going to populate more and to become a tax burden for the white man. Right? That's the dichotomy of social media today. And so let's see what it says. So Stormfront, voting a straight Republican ticket and defeating the Democratic Party is the major goal of white nationalism. The Democratic Party is the party of Jews. There you go. You know, we said that a long time ago in this video, right? That the crossover between Jewish people being communists and that communists were the ones that were pushing integration in schools. Well, that's deteriorating the American way of life, and therefore they are Jewish, right? It's the elders of Zion. The Democratic Party has been the Communist Party in America since 1862. Pretty specific date, but there you go. There's the crossover with Bill Gale from Judaism to communism. Here we get the Rothschild bankers, of course, right? I'm sure George Soros can be wrapped up in this too. The Democratic Party has promoted communism. They want to bring in Muslims, Mexicans, and communist Chinese, of course, immigration. This is replacement theory. Right, and in a cruder, more basic sense, this is going back to what we talked about with taxes, and this is what we go back and talk about with segregation, right, and the desegregation efforts. Jews and the media, right, of course, right, because it's one thing to say the neoliberal media, it's another thing to say the liberal media, it's another to say the media elites. But when you get down to it, when you get to the end of that red pill, it's Jews in the media, right? It's the Jew corrupted Congress. And this is where you get into the discussions about, Democrats are anti-Semitic, right, from the Republican side. Well, a lot of that is public-facing argumentation. But, when you get into these discussions about the Zionists, for instance, and their power over Congress and their lobby effort, that's when it gets complicated, right? But Jews control Congress. Jews are a Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party has been the Communist Party. The Communist Party works with the Rothschild bankers. They want to bring in minority people for replacement theory. Joe McCarthy warned America of communist infiltration. It was the Jewish media and the Democratic Party that smeared and slandered him. So he was right. And remember his communication with Upton Close and what that meant, right? So there were overt anti-Semitic discussions occurring even in that time. The Hollywood Jews, of course, right? Jewish president and Democrat FDR, Israel, communism and Jewish and blah, 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 blah. The deadly enemy of the ordinary man, the Democratic Party. Well, here it is, right? I mean, this is what, you get from CPAC. This is what you get from the Republican Party, essentially. And this is, these are the people that are endorsing in the most raw and honest form. It's a long story. And really, to be fair, it's probably multiple stories. It's probably a series, and perhaps that'll happen in the future. But in order to understand the overarching theme, I think it's important to go through this step by step and show the evolution, to show Christian identity, the significance of Bill Gale, desegregation, the Red Scare, how that transitioned into a multitude of proto-militias and political organizations and civic organizations being rolled into things like taxes, that while being extreme in and of itself within that movement, helped to move it more towards the center, and then discussing some real life things such as Oath Keepers training police officers and what happened on January 6th. And the Republican Party saying things like this is legitimate political discourse, to only have people involved with that a short while later be found guilty of sedition, right? Sedition is legitimate discourse. And the ideas that would drive and justify someone to say such things, as well as the idea of populism, which I'm not going to go into here, but which clearly draws from reactionary, bigoted, anti-Semitic origins. It is not needed in critiques if you're looking at material views of the world, right? If you're on the left, if you're in the center even, you don't need that, right? That stuff, we've seen what it is, and we've seen where it comes from. And that is what it means, regardless of what the person's intentions are, who is parroting it, saying it. The intentions are fine, but this is where it comes from. This is what it means. And there are many people that are involved with that for more nefarious reasons. So I hope this was informative. It was a big one. What you can do to help is, I don't want any money, but you can like the video, you can subscribe to the channel, and you can check out the website, therightpodcast.org. Spread the word. This is all grassroots. I am not interested in profiting from this. This is just education and somebody who sees this happening daily and is just outraged by it.